Hello and welcome to In Conversation, a Dublab podcast where each week we will bring you interviews from the Dublab radio archives.
Welcome to another Love Injection Conversations with Barbie and Paul on Dublab.
Today we have a very special guest, Mr. Tim Lawrence. He teaches, does research, and is one of the founders of the Center of Cultural Studies at the University of East London, and as well as written three very important books, namely Love Saves the Day, Arthur Russell, Hold On to Your Dreams, and most recently Life and Death on the New York Dancefloor, 1980 to 1983.
Welcome, Tim.
Hello. Thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you so much for carving this time out of your busy schedule this week.
It's a pleasure.
Can you tell us a little bit about what your week's been like? What have you been up to?
It's been insane. I'm in a post-sleep period right now. I think I go to bed at it seems to somehow end up being 2 or 3 in the morning. And I'm not sure if I'm sleeping and dreaming about the book or just lying in bed thinking about the book and all the stuff that's going on around it. But yeah, so the book's come out a few weeks ago. And, I'm here in the States for just over 2 weeks. I had a couple of trips out of New York City to begin to kick things off and get a few talks going and out of the way. And then on Friday, I came back to the city, and there's really pretty much back-to-back events or launch events, a really amazing array of events, actually, that have been unfolding since then, really. And they carry on until the week. Oh, what day is it today? No, it's Monday, isn't it?
Yeah, it's Monday.
So next Monday, they carry on until next Monday, and then I'm kind of getting up at the crack of dawn on Tuesday to leave. But yeah, so I'm busy with doing book stuff. But, it's kind of weird, or it's not weird at all, that this stuff, I ended up doing research about something I just felt passionate about. I came to New York City to kind of do some to take part on the doctoral program in English literature at Columbia University, partly because I really wanted to do that. There's a whole history to that, but also because my favourite DJ was working in New York City. The favourite DJ at the time, Louis Vega, and I just wanted to be able to, it was just essential to hear what Louis was doing in the early to mid 1990s. And so I wanted to do that. And then this strange thing happened where my passion became my work. And so there is this, everything gets, blurry and
Sure.
into each other now. So, on some level it's work, but as we experienced yesterday, right, there's an awful lot of partying around this work.
We always talk about that when, the difference between our quote, air quotes, work and real work and kind of our passion projects.
Everybody, a lot of people we call it side hustle, but,
Right.
How can you blend that one into the other? Before we, there's a story to you. Obviously, we hear from your accent. You're not from here.
I am. What do you mean I'm not from here?
You're like an honorary New Yorker. But we wanted to kind of kick off and introduce you to the folks listening at home as, what was your first experience with nightlife in the UK first?
Oh, in the UK? Oh, well, that's a bizarre story and almost an embarrassing one, but it's also a wonderful one, is that I was, I always like music, kids do, right? So there's nothing special about that. I think there was something in me that always was kind of seeking out kind of, really intensely rhythmic music, because I kind of like dancing, but there was no kind of obvious place for that to go as I was growing up in kind of a very suburban area, kind of well outside of London. I'm Jewish. I was the only Jew in my school. There were no black kids, no Asian kids. It was sort of, looking back, slightly kind of dull experience. My parents were kind of wonderful people, and I had a great kind of childhood and upbringing, but the area wasn't so interesting. I went to study at Manchester University, and I was kind of into politics, really. I was studying politics and modern history. It was my undergraduate degree. And I stayed up one summer at the end of my second year to run a Jewish summer camp. I'd been my kind of cosmopolitanization, if that's such a word, I'm pretty sure there isn't, was partly through my mum in particular persuading me after I'd done my bar mitzvah at the age of 13 to kind of get involved in the Jewish youth club. And I wasn't kind of too interested, really. I hadn't got that engaged by going on to sort of kind of going to Hebrew classes or whatever religion school on Sunday, and my parents weren't that interested either. But was kind of like, how do you hold on to your Jewish identity in an area where there's nothing? My dad had come out of Nazi Germany on the Kindertransport, which was these trains put on by the Allies to take young Jewish children out of Nazi Germany. So there was something in the family where there was this profoundly important kind of aspect to our Jewish identity. But then we were living in my dad came, he went to night class, he became, even though German was his first language, obviously, he became an English teacher, and his first job was indeed in this very suburban area. So there was this kind of all these lines were pointing in these different directions. I went to this, my mum said, go to this Jewish youth club. I wasn't interested. And it just turned out very, very quickly, turned out to be a way of kind of connecting with Jewish kids from all over the country, actually, and particularly from London and Manchester. There were weekends away. There were summer camps. It was a lot of it was good fun, but it was also educational. It did kind of give me something completely else that I wasn't getting in my school. And so it was during my time at Manchester University in the second year that I was running a summer camp for Jewish kids. So I had more power then than I've ever had subsequently. It's like I was in charge. I was like a 22-year-old with no qualifications, basically in charge of 120 kids, doing whatever I wanted to do with them with a bunch of other youth leaders for 2 weeks. And that summer, before the camp kicked in, a friend from that whole kind of camp culture, Jewish youth movement culture, said, we here at the Hacienda, there's this kind of, it's really kind of taking off. Why don't we go down there? And I knew nothing about club culture. As I say, I was doing politics and modern history. Manchester, I love music, but I did, house music hadn't really broken through in a kind of obvious way at all. And we went to this night. It was a Wednesday night. Again, it all seemed somewhat improbable. And this was hot. I only found out years later, really. And we walked in. And the place was just on fire. It was just unbelievable. And it was the podiums, everyone on the podiums, hands in the air, whistles, house music really heard for the first. I now know that it was an awful sound system, and I would probably now hear it at that. But at the time, it was like music that it was a sound system. I'd never heard anything like it before. And the place was throbbing and unbelievably dynamic. This music that I'd never heard before. It's very deconstructed, very electronic, very propulsive, quite conceptual. And very, very rhythmic, and it was like, and it took me, I keep saying, and I swear to God this is true, it took me about 5 seconds to get from the entrance door onto one of those podiums and to be just like throw myself. It was just like completely instantaneous kind of attraction to this culture. I just had a fantastic time, and it was kind of in the days and weeks that followed that the tabloids started saying things like, everyone's on ecstasy orgies and the rest of it, and I was like, no, you don't understand. It's the music. But then that come the autumn, I went, then went home for a few weeks, I think, and then came back to university, and I went on a Friday night, with some friends, just thinking, go to the Hacienda. And it was a kind of some sort of indie night or whatever. I just wasn't interested, to be honest. I don't want to upset anyone who likes indie music, but it just did nothing for me, really. It seemed sort of introspective and self-indulgent, no rhythm, no blackness, let's be honest, da-di-da-di-da. And I was like, oh, so it's over then. I knew somehow there wasn't the whole network of communication that we have now and take for granted back then. So I had no knowledge of how party culture functioned. I didn't have an idea that on different nights of the week you might have different scenes congregating in a club. So I just assumed it was all over. It was my third year anyway, so I was kind of serious studying. Finally, I'd kind of done other stuff for 2 years, so I was kind of get focused. And it was then only a few years later, having moved back to London, and was doing a postgraduate diploma in newspaper journalism, because I'd kind of decided to go down that route initially. That a friend involved in Labour Party politics actually took me to my first rave, and that was also extraordinary experience. But it wasn't quite, I absolutely loved it. It was very memorable. But very soon after that, the same friend took me to this place called the Gardening Club, Feel Real Night. And it was in Covent Garden. It was like in a basement. It was a very cellar-y kind of atmosphere, a really quite good sound system, actually. And the vibe was unbelievable. It was just kind of, there was a certain drug going around at the time, and I certainly dabbled in a bit at the time. And both my parents had died at this point, so I was in search of some sort of solace, community, and I was feeling pretty bad about things, even though my kind of professional career was going quite well, but life felt a bit tough. And And I had my sense of kind of being okay on this dance floor. And it was, funnily enough, at a book launch event recently in London, the first one, the main launch we did there, the guy who really kind of just pulled that whole night together as far as I was concerned, a guy called Chris, Rhythm Doctor, who was kind of one of the collective 4 DJs. Very early on, I started to give this guy like 50 quid a week or something. I said, just whatever music you're buying, get it for me as well. And it was there that they invited Louis Vega along. He had made, he was flying over. He would kind of play several clubs maybe in one night, but he came along, did his 2-hour spot at Feel Real. And, I do remember the records he played, actually. It was very vivid. I remember crying, and that sort of, they already had a very New Yorky kind of sound, which was going well beyond what the rave sound was doing. There was kind of jazz, there was dub, there was soul, mixed in with all this kind of electronic kind of music, electronic kind of outlook or synthesis. And that was kind of it, really. That was really where, there's a whole mythology to New York already for me, because my dad's mum had come out of Nazi Germany and gone to live in upstate New York in Liberty. But when I was receiving dollar checks for my birthdays through the post with the Statue of Liberty on them, I didn't know that Liberty was upstate New York. So there was also this there was always sort of New York was there. And then, of course, it's a city that's big in people's imagination anyway. So all of these things eventually came together to lead me.
So what eventually made you actually move here? What was the catalyst?
Well, so I'd heard Louis at the gardening club. I was really into what was going on at the gardening club. I got what was supposed to be my dream job in political journalism, working at BBC Newsnight. This must have been the beginning of 1993. And I was already going out dancing, and I'm pretty sure that it was on the first day I started working at Newsnight. I actually went into psychotherapy. I was not feeling good about life. As I say, my parents had died. I bizarrely almost hadn't put 2 and 2 together and thought that there might be a relationship between the two things. And, psychotherapy wasn't that well as a wider practice at the time. But anyway, even it was within a couple of weeks I realised that I needed to stop my kind of the daily grind. I wasn't finding journalism that fulfilling. I wanted to kind of always be able to go a little bit deeper. And also at the time we had a really depressing government. Margaret Thatcher had been in power for 10 years. She had been kind of kicked out, but she'd been replaced by a really bland version of herself, a guy called John Major, another conservative. And he'd won a landslide election. And then there kept being these corruption stories we were reporting on. And it just seemed that nothing was going to get rid of this conservative government. And so I started to sort of, all these things were coming together. I got more interested at the time anyway in what I would call cultural politics. I mean, I still am obviously interested in that. But it seemed to be like, well, if we're not going to change who's running the country, let's at least try and find other ways of kind of engaging and seeing where the possibilities of change might be. And it was also around this time that a professor at Columbia University called Edward Said did something called the BBC Wreath Lectures. It's when an intellectual, an academic, a researcher is invited to do 6 lectures that are then broadcast on BBC Radio. And Edward Said was this Palestinian professor who was quite involved with Middle Eastern politics, the Israel-Palestine question, and he had also been a founding figure in what we can now call post-colonial theory. He'd written a very famous book called Orientalism, and then he'd had a second book or another book on this subject called Culture and Imperialism, which was kind of written for a wider audience. And it just looked at the way that imperialism and the assumptions of imperialism were embedded in English literature, including even the novels of, say, Jane Austen. And I read this book and I just thought it was amazing because it was about culture, it was about politics, and it was also about being, with the Wreath Lectures, the Wreath Lectures were about the very idea of the public intellectual. And so I'd made this choice between carrying on with research or becoming a journalist. And at the time I thought, let's go to journalism because, at the time it seemed to me that was the best way of having an impact. And then I found I was beginning to feel its impact was limited. And I began to find the kind of, even in a kind of quite a interesting critical and analytical program like Newsnight, that I wasn't kind of getting the level of analysis that I wanted. And then this guy, Edward Said, comes along and says, look, you can actually be in the university sector and you can also be reaching a wider public. So it seemed like, I could bridge both worlds, do research, but also kind of not be just bound within a university system. And my dad had, as I said, had eventually become an English teacher. I was looking for some sort of meaning in my life. I was quite depressed, and I thought, okay, let's go to live in New York City. Let's go and read literature, read about the meaning of life, as I would have said even at the time, life and death. I might not have said on the New York dance floor, but that was also in my mind because I was hearing Louis Vega and all this New York, even when Louis wasn't around, Chris, the Rhythm Doctor, that whole collective. It was a very New Yorky kind of sound, and I was buying music like crazy at this point. I was spending ridiculous sums of money on it. I did have some disposable income because I was reasonably successful in my job, and I was buying an awful lot of vinyl. And I just thought, okay, go and do a doctorate at Columbia University, read literature, as my dad in particular had, but my mum also was very, very immersed in literature. Do that by day, and and then at night go to hear Louis Vega at Sound Factory Bar Wednesday nights, Underground Network, hosted by Don Welch and Barbara Tucker, and it was just and that was the kind of diversion my kind of life took. So that I came to live in New York City. It must have been the autumn of 1994. I had a reconnaissance trip in 1993. Went to Sound Factory Bar during that trip. It was a really interesting night, and came back. So that's when I came over and to live in New York.
So we something that we read too once you got here and got to Columbia. What was the impetus for starting to write Love Saves the Day as a
question, yeah.
quote unquote suggestion from a professor?
Yeah, so it's a great story. So there's a Professor Rob Nixon who was also interested in writing books that would kind of appeal to a wider public. And he and one or two others, but in particular Rob, knew of my interest in dance music. And he just suggested, because he had a kind of keen eye for a story, if you like, said, why don't you write, and I quote, a quick book about dance music culture? So I thought, okay, I'll do that. And the idea was to write history of house music, beginning in mid-80s Chicago, and also to a lesser extent New York, but also coming over to New York, tracking how this music got over to, as I say, the Hacienda in particular, in the summer of 1988, that summer that by accident I stumbled into the club and ended up on the podium in about 5 seconds flat, and then led to this other thing that I'd referred to just earlier, the John Major government introducing this ridiculous legislation that came to be known, that was known as the Criminal Justice Act, that did make illegal rave culture, along with hunt saboteurs, road protesters. It was a real assortment of kind of, itinerant type people who are actually just doing a perfectly good job in the world. But the John Major government was looking for some kind of populist cause to give themselves a bit more of a kind of an idea or direction, because it was just a government that was going nowhere, but it seemed like they were going to be there forever. So that was the idea of the book, was to just kind of write this quick book about the rise of house music mutating into rave culture in the UK and its banning. So that was how that started. And very early on in the process, I interviewed this guy, David Mancuso of the Loft, and there was this very interesting thing, because at the time, nothing had really been written at all about David. And I remember asking several people before doing the interview, because, time is short, life is, there's lots to get on with in life. And this was already a side project. Who is this guy, David? And a few people, including a guy, I won't name him because I don't want to embarrass him. But he went on to publish a book about New York house music. And he said, well, David is kind of, you don't really need to talk with David. He's kind of unto himself. He's got this kind of, he's into audiophile sound. No one else kind of bothers with that. He's not that influential. He's unto himself. He's got his own way of doing things. And, he's interesting, but not really relevant to the wider scene. So I thought, okay, well, I think I'd already set up the interview. So I went to meet David, and we sat in an East Village Italian restaurant for 3 hours, and I fancied myself as being pretty knowledgeable about dance music at this point. And, we did this 3-hour interview, and I barely followed a single word that David said for the whole 3 hours. And it was partly because he thinks in quite tangential ways. And it was also partly because he hadn't been had his history sorted out then, because he'd been doing all this stuff for years, but he hadn't been interviewed, I think, pretty much since 1983. This is 1997. There was one other very, very short interview that appeared with him, I think, a couple of years earlier, but it was like 200 words long or something. So he wasn't used to recounting a story. And so we sat, and there were all these references that we are now quite familiar with, but at the time just weren't out there. The New York City Record Pool, Reed Street, Soho Place, Steve DeQuisto, Michael Capello, Bobby Guttadaro, and just kind of all these venues that were the 10th floor, the Gallery, which is a little bit better known as well. But there was just largely, it was kind of like... It was like, okay, David, stop. You need to kind of go. But then there was Leary and, the period when LSD was legal and all sorts of other things, Woodstock. And so that I was more familiar with. But by the end of the interview, I thought, okay, this has been really unusual experience, very disorienting, quite disconcerting. I don't want to go here at all. David was like, you go back to 1970. And I was like, well, this book starts in mid-1980s, but I'll see what I can do. But I was also, I'd come from journalism, so this kind of little bell was ringing saying, hang on a second, there's this guy has spoken for this culture for 3 hours non-stop, and I haven't understood a single reference. What on earth is going on here? And by the time I got home that night, there were about 5 messages on the answer machine from various people who David knew, all wanting to talk. David had already been in touch with them, and they'd already left messages on my answer machine saying they were ready. Steve DeQuisto would have certainly been one. I forget who the others were. And it just became absolutely clear there was this story to be told. And I wasn't quite sure at that point about whether it would be kind of... relevant to anything, but I was kind of on this house mission at the time. So I'd already set up interviews with Tony Humphries, Frankie Knuckles, David Morales, who are 3 of the towering house music kind of figures of that period. And I went to interview each one of them. And at some point in the interview, I would ask them just to try and start to, this cross-referencing process that informs a lot of the research that I do. I said, so, I met this guy. It seemed really interesting, but I'd never heard of him, and no one else really seems to kind of know much about him. David Mancuso of the Loft. Have you heard of him? Did you ever go to his parties? And it was like almost in some kind of semi-religious recital, they would say, David Mancuso taught me about the power of dance music. The Loft was a space where I felt freest in my life. This was where I learned about the potential of the dance floor. And they all gave these near identical kind of replies. And I was like, okay, right, we're onto something here, And so I interviewed David mercilessly for a period of years. Actually, I mean, I've no idea how many interviews we did, but they were strange and wonderful and compelling interviews, and often there were elements of even frustration because they would go off in these tangents, and sometimes, but even when they did, and I was like, felt kind of like I wanted to get somewhere else, the tangent would often be just like remarkably interesting. I remember the New York City Record Pool was a big part of that. I was like, I don't want to go into this stuff about getting free records from the major record companies, but it became this amazing story about how DJs decided to become a collective force and to demand some rights in relationship to the record companies, whose records they were turning into international hits and were not even getting the records for free. So even that, that I thought would be uninteresting, turned out to be what I feel anyway was an integral part of this story of the 1970s. So I'm going on about this, I'm sorry. But
this is all really interesting. Yeah.
But this was, so I was speaking to my editor, and, my proposal had gone off to, it was a Duke University Press. They'd been recommended to me as being the kind of most interesting, hottest university press that was kind of knew how to make books that would potentially reach a wider audience, would be quite cutting edge, interesting books you want to read, which wasn't always the case with academic books. They could sometimes be on the dryish side. That was their reputation. And my editor I loved, and immediately, because he just knew so much about this culture. He was immersed in it, and so many other cultures. He's just a remarkable guy, Ken Wissaker. And the book had gone off to peer review, because this is the process of a university of academic research. You have anonymous people review your ideas, which is how you're supposed to verify the quality of the research. And both the reviewers had come back and said a few things, which included, look, you've got to have at least one chapter on disco. And my editor was also particularly keen for me to be interviewing people, but I started to do that anyway and had realised the importance of it. Because initially I thought I didn't need to interview anyone. Initially I thought, I'll just go to the kind of style magazines and music magazines of the era, get that stuff, and then do the kind of clever cultural theory stuff and tell everyone what they were experiencing, what the real truth of it was. It was a very slightly arrogant approach. And then it was in meeting David, immediately it's like the entire world was turned upside down, kind of, within the space of 3 hours. And so they came back also, the peer review, saying, look, at least have a chapter on disco. And I was like, okay, I agree to that. I can see the need to introduce this story of what came to be known as house music. And that one chapter, became this 500-page book, 180,000 words, that just about got up to 1979. And, there was this, the book almost wrote itself, in the end, because it was just unbelievable. I mean, at the time, no one really knew about the relationship between the Loft and the Paradise Garage. Now we just, it's kind of taken for granted. But I sat down with Mel Sharon. It was an ever so slightly tetchy interview, because Mel had fallen out with David. Mel Sharon of West End Records, and I got Mel to kind of say, because I suspected it, but it hadn't been kind of said very clearly, that Michael Brodie got the idea of opening the Paradise Garage, and as primarily from his going to the Loft and from it and wanting to turn the garage into a kind of expanded version of the Loft. So that was like kind of major. Then I realised quite early on, partly through David and interviewing the other guys who opened these parties, the Gallery, the 10th Floor, and then from there, Flamingo, but we can then follow through the Reed Street, Soho Place, all were kind of parties that took David's template and kind of developed it, 12 West as well. But then also, just even more remarkably, there was this kind of story of what was going on in the warehouse in Chicago, where Larry Levan was offered this job to go and work in 77, but was waiting for the Paradise Garage to open, so didn't take up that job and offered it to Frankie Knuckles. And the guy who opened that venue, I had absolutely no idea until I interviewed him, and I haven't actually seen him interviewed very much elsewhere, to be honest, but I'm sure he has been since. But at the time, I don't believe anyone had interviewed him. Robert Williams. So I'm all like, okay, so, how do you set up the warehouse in Chicago? And he said, well, actually, I used to live in New York, and I used to go to this party. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's this party called the Loft.
All
and
roads lead
it was
to
just
David.
like, I was like, okay, this book is just writing itself. It's how it was, it wrote itself. And it was like, I used to go to the Loft. David it was just such a Loft thing. David saw me on the street one day. He said he liked the look of me, or we got talking, and he said, look, we got talking somehow. I mean, this is David, right? It's community. You're on the street, you're meeting people, you're open to the world. And we got talking, and he said, why don't you come? I put on a party. Why don't you come? On this Saturday night. And that was Robert Williams becoming immersed in the Loft. It was probably, I'm almost certain it would have been the Broadway Loft, David's first one. And Robert Williams then subsequently moved to Chicago, would tell his mates in Chicago about the stories of the Loft. And they said, well, why don't you do something like that here? And that was the warehouse. At the time, less so, well, not entirely less so now. I mean, it was all about house music and what was called garage music, which was kind of vocal house. It's like both of these roads, the warehouse is kind of, it doesn't quite come out of house music, but the name house music does. The warehouse closes in 1983 and house music really comes through in 1984. But they were calling the music that Frankie Knuckles would play at the warehouse house music, because house just being short for warehouse. And it was this mix of, the kind of music that I really discuss in this new book, really. But they called that house music. And without the warehouse, the stuff that followed and kind of cultivated house music almost certainly wouldn't have happened, at least in the way that it did. So both house music and garage kind of also went back to the Loft. And we could talk about this for hours. So the book is not just about the Loft and its influence on the 70s, but also it was, it's this utopia, as you know yourselves, right? It's this kind of utopian space. It's about bringing together all these different elements within a very community-oriented setting. This is the reason that I have no doubt whatsoever in my mind why the Loft has endured. It's because its foundations are so clear and are so honest and are so principled. David has really, remarkably pure, I say in the book, book somewhere. He's a remarkably purist guy, and that has enabled him for the party and the vision to endure. There's been numerous opportunities for him to go off and chase the dollar, to make a bit more money, to do whatever. I mean, he never played the visit, the DJ on tour kind of thing. He wanted to be in his home because he felt that was more intimate and the party could be more powerful there. And it was only when he basically fell on hard times. Excuse me. It was only when he fell on hard times and couldn't put on parties in his own home anymore because he was living in a tiny, tiny place that he said, okay, this is a compromise that I just have to make. I have to go and put on a party in somewhere that's not my own home. And we sort of ended up doing this in London, so I got to understand the process very well. And he was always like, okay, even if we're not going to do it in my own home, the place that we do it in has to feel homely. And he would then say, the first thing I look at in a venue, if I'm not going to be doing it in my own home, is like, would I like to sleep there that night? Would I feel comfortable? These are very important ideas, but I don't think they necessarily are taken that deep into some of the culture these days. In some places they are, but other places perhaps not. I got so much more to say about this, but I'm sure we'll move on to other things. But anyway, so the Loft, and was a very big part of the Love Saves the Day, obviously, and it's deep and it's dear to my heart. But the book also traces the way that this culture grew into this thing known as disco. And initially, disco was kind of an exciting thing. Initially, disco, I'll try and end this soon. Disco didn't mean what we now think of as disco. Disco was music you would hear on the discotheque dance floor. David didn't have a discotheque dance floor as a private party, but there were public discotheques. And even these places where Steve D'Acquisto and Michael Capello and Francis Grasso and all these other DJs, T. Scott, then Larry Levan, Frankie Knuckles a bit, they were all playing. And it was like all the music kind of in the world, really, that you might play and draw on in order to get people to dance. And you got these quite diverse crowds. And this was disco music, all this music. And then disco congealed into something, and the thing it congealed into was in and of itself really great until it just got turned into a product. But that was like 1978. So the book traces that whole story. But there's always David because he was such an interesting guy and so influential, he keeps coming in and out of the narrative, because that's the way the book needed to be written.
I'm going to ask a very simple question. What is the process like to write a book? Because you mentioned this this kind of people that review your information and give you kind of feedback and to kind of fact check your ideas. Well, from start to finish, what's that process like, and how long does it usually take?
It seems to take me about 7 years to write a book. So it's I don't do this full time. I teach as well, so that takes up a fair amount of my life. But that also kind of, I think there's something good about that. It keeps you sort of I don't know about honest, but you're with young people and stuff, and they're pretty sharp and they got their own ideas. So I think that's one of the things is it's never just something I just do. I never just sit down and write. But it's I would say overall it's a very kind of immersive kind of project. So and the culture I write about is immersive as well, or I'm drawn to the aspects of the culture that are most immersive. So I guess I just like immersive. I'm drawn to immersive stuff. The books are also kind of, some people might say they're longer than they should be. I can't be the judge of that. Obviously, one of the reasons I like writing with the publisher I do is they let me write long, but then the parties I like writing about are long parties. I just think you can get more going on in this thing. So they're very immersive. There's an aspect of a struggle to writing them, I would say, because the story's never clear. I mean, you've already got the sense of what I was saying about Love Saves the Day, that it rolled over several times before it turned into what it was going to become. And then it was it's often interviewing hundreds of people. Someone said quite recently, I'm not sure I'm quite remembering the quote exactly, but it was along the line of the writing the way that I write is akin to a kind of community project or a community building project or something. I should dig out the quote because it was quite nice. And it was just someone said about the stuff that I write. And then I thought, well, it's kind of true in a way, because there's all theyese people, who've been involved in, just their lives. And sometimes it's just socializing, or sometimes it's something that they end up doing, it's like David, it's what he does. that is absolutely driving obsession in life, and to the point of almost not having relationships because he was so absorbed with party culture. So it's like trying to bring these people together whose voices haven't really been heard. The 5 people who had already left the kind of voice, the messages on the answer machine by the time I got home after me. These people want to talk, and people haven't really been listening to them. And then it's like, how do you recreate this community of voices in a book? So there's kind of complicated because the voices sometimes contradict each other. Sometimes the voices think more highly of themselves than other people do, and stories can get a bit twisted. And as David DePino, one of Larry Levan's best mates, told me in the writing of the current book, sometimes memories are a bit hazy, because of the aging process, because of time, and because of things that people might do on the dance floor as well. But one way or another, through sheer persistence, if I compare myself to a mode of transport, I call myself a train. Because I just think there's this thing of, you just get on the track and you just keep on going. And, and I don't think it necessarily makes you a good, nice human being or anything, but it's the mode of transport that's necessary to get through these things. So it's that as well, really. These are endurance projects. But the other thing I would say is I feel incredibly privileged. What I quickly realized is that I was meeting people who I just thought were the most, engaging, dedicated, creative, and often community-minded people I'd ever met. And I thought their vision of the world was extraordinary. I thought their contribution to the world was extraordinary. I couldn't quite understand why what they had done hadn't been written about before in the way that I felt needed to be said, or if at all. So I just felt lucky to be able to kind of, get to know them. You can kind of do this stuff from a distance, but I really enjoyed meeting them. I mean, these people also some of them became friends. I think there's no question about that. And even if they didn't become friends, they were just like they are these remarkable people who, thrown themselves into this scene, and this was also true of the Arthur Russell book. This guy who'd sort of a little bit disappeared, from, without being fully recognised, without being understood. But there were all these people who had always believed in his music, the beauty of his music, the brilliance of his music, and the extraordinary idea of the way he wanted to make music. Mainly collaboratively, the way he believed in other people more than himself, whatever it was. And there was this group of friends, some family, who just wanted to talk. And so I'm just, my role really is to give them voice, to weave together their stories. Which is, and then the other thing I do is then try to give it the framework that kind of allows us to understand in what context does this happen, and what might be the context that allows it to unfold. And what can we learn about that? The more socioeconomic, kind of background that can be dull, but I think is interesting and is important to understanding what's going on.
So for Life and Death in the New York Dancefloor, we really like that it opens with a line that says, "Sanity dictated that this book should have told the history of 80s dance culture in the U.S. the same way Love Saves the Day excavated the 70s, charting the chaotic renewal of the post-disco party scene in the early 80s New York, the mid-decade rise of Chicago house and Detroit techno, and the culture's end of the decade decline. As its center of gravity shifted towards Europe, which we discussed about too. And I continue, goes, but Sanity failed to anticipate the ways the early 80s would reveal themselves to be one of the most creatively vibrant and socially dynamic periods of the history of New York. And because of this, you mentioned spending more times moving sideways than forwards for writing this new book.
Yes.
What was that like?
Must have been tough to make that train go sideways.
Yeah, it went off the rails a few times, but it was still a train. D-train. Keep on. So the idea, you kind of Love Saves the Day was supposed to be a different book. No one was supposed to write a book about Arthur Russell because, as my editor said, it's quite a nice idea, but no one's heard of, they're going to say, Arthur who? This book won't sell, I'm sorry, but circumstances, fell in line that enabled me to kind of persuade my editor, and for my editor to agree, actually, maybe people will, because there have been a couple of reissues, came 6 months after I was told that it probably wasn't going to be possible to write that biography, and the reissues created a bit of a stir and enabled me to pursue it. And then there was the new one. There was this this idea that finally I'll write the book that that I said I was going to write for my editor in the first place, that will really be about house music. And you can't not do techno in Detroit, because that would just be kind of a misreading of history, really, and just kind of too angled, really, for what I wanted, I thought. So the idea was to get to that stuff and to honour my original contract, which was to write this history of house music. And there's also this thing, I think, whereby we just, I wasn't that committed to that, but we often think in generic terms. House music has become this towering culture within dance music culture, same with techno, really, and it just seemed obvious to kind of write those stories. And just as I thought that the 70s would be the initial footnote or chapter to what became the history of house music, I thought that the early 80s would become the intro chapter to what became the real story. And I have to say, speaking to a whole bunch of people involved in the scene, even when I started, began to wonder, will I make it all the way to 1988? Because the Paradise Garage closes in September 87. The Saint closes in, I think, the spring of 1988. And those were the two biggest venues, pretty much, of this kind of DJ scene, really, at the time. So that seemed to be the obvious place to end it. And as I was beginning to sort of sound out the possibility that the book might not get up to that point, everyone thought, interviewees were pretty openly disagreeing with me, saying that, you can't end the book in 1983. It doesn't make any sense, really. It's got to be 87 and the closing of the garage and there. But as a little bit you read out indicates, what I stumbled into was this kind of cultural renaissance of I increasingly, the more I talk about this, the more I'm compelled of, show me the city, show me the era when the level of creativity and collaboration and productivity matched what happened in early 1980s in New York. This period that bizarrely hasn't really been written about, but which produced this extraordinary amount of music and art and performance art and film and video and all these other things. So there was this explosion of culture which was about DJing, but it was also about live bands and some of these other things that I've mentioned. And it was a lot about the kind of an art scene and a music scene coming into contact. And these three, what I identify really as these kind of three strands that kind of set up the era, but then came to define it, because in the way that they interacted. So there was this post-disco kind of moment where there'd been this backlash against disco, this kind of twist that, again, no one, I don't think, had quite cottoned onto, but Danny Krivit articulated really well to me in Love Saves the Day in particular, also David, sort of saying, look, it wasn't just the disco sucks people that were tired of disco. We were tired of disco. Yeah. It had become join the dots music. No one, and David says in the new book, no one wants to dance to a formula. It's boring. Give people music that makes you want to kind of move. That's got something that has something in it. So what had become known as the disco scene, but in my book, actually literally in my book, had always been more than the disco. I didn't use the word disco in Love Saves the Day deliberately, not because I'm anti-disco as such, but to me, what was going on was always more than disco. It preceded it and it surpassed it. And David says this also, and so does David Topino about Larry Levan. Larry never even talked about playing disco music. They always thought it was R&B. So it's nothing. Anyway, it's not anti-disco, but it's like there was always more music going on. So they were already doing this in a sense. But it just so happened that the industry, the majors, pulled back from disco, and the dancers and the DJs wanted something that wasn't formulaic, had something else. And Arthur Russell kind of joins the story at this point, someone who's like just looking for ways of fusing different sounds to keep things a little bit interesting, to go on an exploration, on a journey. So disco was ready for that. The punk scene, the music it was a great idea. It had lots of energy initially, but the music soon became a bit repetitive. It lacked ambition, I think we can probably say. So that whole punk scene was ready to go in a different direction. And then this whole rap thing had only came through as late as the summer of 1979. I think Rapper's Delight was August 79 it was released. And it was kind of, David Toop says in his book Rap Attack, it was an awfully long, awfully dull record when you compared it to, say, Lolita Holloway Hit and Run or something. I mean, it was one idea and it went on for like 13 minutes. It was like, rap music at that point didn't have a sense of a journey or a crescendo or going somewhere with the music. But more than that, it was that people thought it was a gimmick. I now will absolutely solidly say that rap music is mutant disco. We've had decade. You read all the histories of hip hop and stuff, and you will barely see a reference to disco. And when it is, it's usually about rap being anti-disco, about taking it somewhere else. Disco having gone white. I spend a lot of time in the new book trying to unpick this. A colleague and friend sort of said, so the modus operandi of the book is to throw a veil over the future, so you don't know what happens next, and then to kind of take the history as it was happening and what it therefore meant to people at the time. And at the time, rap hadn't become this thing with a capital R that actually for a period in the late 80s became quite aggressive, quite macho, sometimes a bit homophobic, for reasons that were to do with what was going on in the black community at the time. There was a crack epidemic. Reagan was, touting stuff that was, cutting welfare, giving inner cities were under siege at that point, and the black community was under siege, and it was in that context that it became what it partly became. But that was later. It wasn't. It was something else in this period. So rap music was kind of a gimmick. But even the guys who were making it, as we all know, they were already working with found objects. They had to be resourceful. That was the whole principle of it. You were finding funk, and as Bambaataa told me, they were playing loads of disco. Hank Shockley told me they were playing loads of disco. You won't see this in any rap history that's been published today. Others might follow, of course, but they were hammering disco, they were hammering funk. Then when Danny Krivit and David stopped playing some disco because it was lacking the funk, and it was getting a bit too Euro, and it was a bit too much of the Bee Gees, and some of it was a bit too repetitive. The downtown DJs were also not playing this stuff. Anyway, rap was already like, here's this music, we're fine. Well, whatever. Bambaataa, it's notorious, right? The master of records. His record collection is, as broad as anyone's, really. It wasn't just about one sound, and that's how rap was formulated. You take other music and you find something in it. You make a composite music out of that. So all of these three scenes, and hip-hop didn't even exist as a concept at this point. I go on about this at some length. The four elements weren't conceived of as the four elements, and they weren't really the four elements. They weren't this kind of fused culture that we now imagine. So rap was actually quite open. It wasn't being taken seriously. It wasn't seen as wasn't going to resolve any industry's problems. It was already using found objects, so that was quite open. And also in this period, these guys from the Bronx, primarily during 1981, although it's beginning to the seeds are sown in 1980, are starting to come from the Bronx downtown. So they're all. It's kind of everything is waiting to happen. It's like the start button has been reset, and nothing. There are no rules. What has been passed had its value, but something new is required, and everyone is kind of in this kind of open frame mindset. And the corporations are pulled out, which is kind of important because they had come in and they contort. They have marketing programs. They have production schedules. They have all these, targets of how many records need to be sold, and this is how these operations work. They had gone out because there was a recession, disco had gone bust, and all the rest of it, and they never really liked the culture in the first place, as we kind of know. So it was in this setting. Sorry for this rather long answer. That all these musics were able to kind of suddenly, not only pursue what they wanted to do, but to meet and intersect and interact. And the kind of one of the primary arguments of the book is that this cultural nation, this unbelievable explosion of culture and music and DJing and bands and the rest of it kind of happened because of the hybridity and the cross-fertilization that took place, that the music got to be more interesting and got to be, and has endured because it was like the scenes were not closed in on themselves, but were actually opening out and interested in what the other scenes were doing, and the people were occupying not only their scenes but were journeying between. So writing the Arthur Russell book helped. If I'd gone straight from Love Saves the Day to the new one, I don't think I'd have got it. I would have struggled. And even when I got there, it was a bit of a struggle. I didn't initially open with the Mud Club, but as I immersed myself more and more in interviewing the research, you kind of just realise, look, the story here is not just about what happens at the Loft or the garage. This is a story about the way that those parties continue and start to interact with the rest of the scene, and other parts of the scene interact with them as well. And this is what makes it such an extraordinarily vibrant period. And yet, it never really had a name. And that's one of the other things that I suspect is the case is, well, why hasn't anyone written about this period before in a focused kind of way? Well, because, we tend to understand our culture in short, and me as along with everyone else in shorthand terms. How can you look it up? What's it called and stuff? How do we get our bearings in relationship to it? This music, it's hard to get your bearings in relationship to it, but that appeals because the Loft was all about this as well. And I obviously, one of the things is I just. Somehow or other, I kind of instinctively connected with what David was doing, and a lot of that comes through, and Arthur Russell, and that comes through, I think, in the new book.
The version that we hear a lot nowadays is the Francois K version.
Yes.
I heard that Arthur wasn't too pleased about it.
No, it's a myth.
Is that not true?
Well. It is said that when he first heard the Francois K version at the Prince Street Loft, he was upset because he thought the drums needed to be fatter, and he went up to Will Sokolov, who he had met at the Loft, and that's how they set up Sleeping Bag Records, and said, Francois, he's trying to ruin me, or something along those lines, because Arthur was, a bit excitable. He cared passionately about his music, and he had a really specific idea about what things should be, and it was really extraordinary, and not everyone always managed to kind of articulate that specificity. There's an amazing thing about Arthur is he always wanted other people to sing his songs because he thought they had a better voice than him, or were better looking, or more charismatic, or whatever. And and those people who were singing these songs, they would invariably come back and say, but Arthur, your version is the definitive version. Anyway, so there was, he'd recorded Go Bang with Dinosaur L that appears on this album, 24 music. And he was a bit upset with what Francois did with the drums and how they were recorded. I mean, Arthur could spend a whole day in the studio driving his co-musicians absolutely insane while he mic'd up the drum. And they would just be like, well, Arthur, sorry, we're going home now. We've been waiting for 8 hours, and you still haven't kind of got that sound right. So this was but it's also because of that attention to detail that we hear the music we hear today. I mean, there is something quite magical about Arthur's music. So he wasn't supposedly momentarily happy about the drums, but then I understand that he saw the response of the crowd, and it became Larry. I mean, I think Larry Levan would go on to say it was his kind of favourite record when he was asked about this in a late 1980s interview. So Arthur I think he got it, and he loved remixes as well. He was one of the first musicians, because there was a lot of resistance to remix culture. We forget this now; it's very easy to forget, but especially in the second half of the 70s. But running through into this period of the early 1980s, musicians would sometimes be wary of remix culture. There was this idea that it was messing around with what the original musicians did, with what the original producer did, and it was often these kind of skinny, spotty, nerdy or gay DJs just kind of doing something with it and turning it into something less. But Arthur was committed to this idea of, number one, making music at every possible opportunity. He was completely obsessed with that, in any means possible. But he also had this kind of, he was, I often say that his Buddhism seemed to be about an expression of his personality more than something that he fundamentally believed in. So I just think, he happened when he ran away to San Francisco and he entered into this Buddhist commune and started a study. I think what it did is it confirmed his outlook on life. And part of that outlook was about the infinite possibility of existence, and music was about that, articulated that infinite possibility of existence. You could, there were all these instrumental combinations. Even the way you mic'd up the drum you could mic it up 1,000 different ways. So he found it, we know, rather painful sometimes to record music or decide on a final take, because to him that was also a sense where you curtailed the possibility of music. You just chose one version and that was it, and then all these other versions, all these other takes, all these other directions the music could have taken get to be halted. And Arthur had certain regrets about that, or certain hesitations, which is why he could record so many takes of the same song. And the thing he loved about remix culture was that you got this idea of a second version, a third version, a fourth version of these takes, as long as it was properly attributed. So sometimes stuff was sampled from him in the late 80s without permission. He wasn't too keen on that. So this Francois was one, I'm just trying to think. No, he had already done a 12. He had already kind of gone into this territory himself. But it was clearly a remarkable 12-inch single. Interestingly, David, for example, always kept on playing the original album version in particular. And even at the last party, in fact, I was even invited to put on a couple of records at the last party. Simon and Guillaume at Lucky Cloud in London, Lucky Cloud Sound System in London, because the book was out, and they just thought it might be nice to put on if I put on a few records. So when I chose the album version of 24/20 of Go Bang on 24/24 Music, and it's an extraordinary record. And I remember, I interviewed Francois at length about the remix, and he was sort of saying all the work he had to do to give it the kind of linearity and the sense of drama that he did. But the original is an amazing piece of music and absolutely stands up by itself. So, anyway.
I have to agree. We almost, we're kind of on a course here, but I almost forgot to ask you about Lucky Cloud. And how that started and what your role is. Yeah, well, so Love Saves the Day was going through production during 2003, and it must have been pretty early into that period. David turned to me and said, "Would you like to put on parties in London?" And it completely freaked me out, really. And I'm like, no, David, that's not what I do. I can just about handle what I'm already doing in life. And I made this I made a mistake, actually, or I said something wrong. I said, "David, also, I'm just not a club promoter." And he turned back to me and said, "Precisely. That's exactly why I'm asking you. In other words, you're not part of the industry. You're not doing it for money. I believe in putting on parties with friends." I'm going to little tangent. I did another interview after Love Saves the Day. This was just maybe a little bit later than this moment in 2003, but only a couple of years, in which I asked David. I just think it's a fantastic kind of story, so I'll say it quickly. So David, I wasn't even sure what I was going to ask him in this interview, because I thought I knew most of what he was always going to say, but a Berlin magazine that only ended up having one issue and closing down almost immediately had asked me to do something about David and Loft, an interview. So I was like, okay, I'll try and make something of this. And actually it was a revelatory interview. I mean, this is the thing about David. There's so much kind of going on in his life experience and mind. And I said, "So David, what do you do when you put on a party?" "Oh, well, the first thing is that you have a group of friends and they want to socialize together, have a party. And then you kind of need a space. You want that space to have good acoustic qualities, a wooden floor so people can dance all night. Without getting kind of tired, good, and it's a home, it's a comfortable space where you can kind of relax. Then you send out some invites to friends, because that's who you want. You want it to be intimate. You don't want it to just be open to everyone. You don't want to sort of publicize it. It's about kind of just people socializing together and friends of friends meeting, so you form relationships. Then you might start decorating the room so it becomes this kind of warm place. Have some balloons so that people again reminds them of their childhood. They can relax, maybe kind of let go a little bit. You put on some food for people, start preparing some food so people can nourish themselves. People might be hungry. They can dance all night and sometimes people, don't always can't always get food easily. So you want to kind of give that to people. And so on and so on. And the very last thing you do is find someone to play music. We were living in a cultural age when the first thing you did was it was all about the cult of the DJ. The only thing that mattered was that DJ, focusing on that DJ. That DJ's mixing, their tricks. And to David, it was the least important thing. And I think so the testimony to this is the way that the Loft has carried on without him. It's a science. It's brilliant. It's philosophy. It's really extraordinary. And he's absolutely right. The way the whole room is set up is you're not really supposed to be looking at the speakers are encouraging you to not look at the DJ. If you do, you've basically got your back to the music. It's like going to a concert and sitting with your back to the orchestra or something, or the band. So the whole room, and so the way the parties in New York and in London have carried on without him is testament to this. So so I said I'm not a club promoter. It's not what I do. And he was like, exactly, it's a party. I should have known to not say that by that point. But it was. So anyway, and he also knew Colleen Murphy, DJ Cosmo, he'd got to know in New York. She had started to go to the Loft, I believe, at 3rd Street, his post-Prince Street location, in the 1990s, possibly. I'm just trying to quite remember when that, maybe the early 1990s. And she had moved to London.
And so for David, the key thing was he had two friends. We'd got to know each other very well through this whole process, and he trusted me from a very early point. It had become self-evident, and he knew Colleen. Colleen had played records, musical hosted some at the Loft a bit. I'm not quite sure how many times, but it certainly had happened. And she had then moved to London, so we had two friends. And he was also, he was struggling a bit at the time, and he'd already gone to Japan to do some parties there. So that was the first time he'd played outside his home, and he'd seen just how committed people were to actually making the right kind of settings that he thought was appropriate, even if it wasn't the Loft in New York City. You could start to get the equipment together and all these principles that I just spoke about. And so I also had, I think it's important to sort of just mention quickly, I had a colleague who was doing house parties, Jeremy Gilbert, who was also writing about dance music culture at the University of London, where I'm based. And he'd come to, when David did the Loft compilation, the first one with Newphonic in 1999, and I'd done the liner notes for that compilation, and then they'd done a party at 93 Fleet Street East, and that was the time that David had first come to London to do some musical hosting. And that party, I brought along this colleague of mine, Jeremy Gilbert, and it had blown him away because he was very into the whole kind of rave culture thing. He was quite into trance sort of music quite a lot at the time. His parties, there was no decks or turntables. He was playing CDs or pre-record CDs where the music was already lined up. It wasn't about the interaction. I went to the first party, and it was a very nice party, but I wasn't quite able to get in. I said, look, you've got to have turntables. And then Jeremy came, and we started doing a few of I would sometimes play at these parties. Jeremy then came to the Newphonic party with David, blew him away, and he said, why don't when it became clear Newphonic weren't going to do more parties with David, Jeremy turned to me and said, why don't we do something with David? Let's ask him over. And Jeremy's kind of like, he's a pretty brilliant guy, actually. He has audacious ideas. He makes things happen. And I was like, this was separate. This had already happened. I was like, no. I don't think, I haven't got time. I haven't got the know-how, the wherewithal. But then David approached, and I thought, well, actually, it didn't seem that obvious, but there's Colleen, this person I'd met Colleen actually a few times in dance tracks because she was working there whilst I was doing my shopping there, but we didn't know each other very well at all. But I thought, well, okay, if Jeremy, my colleague, comes in on it, and then we bring in a couple of other people, we can do it. So that's how it started, June 2003. And we didn't have really a name at the time. David didn't want us to be called the Loft. The Loft was something in New York, and that remained, that's something which was never fully resolved, actually, which we after a short while, we were fine. We're like, we don't really need a name, to be honest. We're a party with a group of friends. The name thing wasn't kind of what we were about. So we came over in June 2003, and, I could talk for hours about this. It was such a fascinating process, but it was, the parties were great. There were points when there was a little bit of a struggle early on. I think I mentioned some of the struggle maybe with the sound system, or was that when I'm losing track of who I've said to what, actually. Maybe that was, but we had this thing of David wanting to recreate the Loft sound system. You couldn't hire this equipment. We hired the best equipment you could hire, but David wasn't happy. He wasn't happy with the engineers who were coming along to set it up because they just didn't understand what he wanted. They were all about equalization, and they were mixers and all these layers upon layers of CRAP that gets layered on top of sound systems. And he was like, I want stereo. Just give me stereo. So eventually, just to keep the party alive, we had to take out quite a large loan. And that became Colleen and Jeremy and myself putting our names on that. And then this is funny, I had never thought of it in this way, but because we were going to a bank saying, give us money, we had to have a name all of a sudden. And so I was already starting the Arthur Russell book, and we were also buying Cliptron speakers. This was part of the big outlay, the speakers and the cables and the amps and the stuff. So that was the major thing. And David was helping us get all this equipment with Cliptrons and the Koetsu cartridges from Japan, which he helped us, and that was one of the reasons we could afford to do it. But we also did this little calculation that I think was quite important and is quite interesting to me. We were spending £2,000 a party on hiring equipment David wasn't happy with. And we said, okay, let's put this over a 5-year period. period, I can't, you can do the maths yourself. Let's see what money would we have been spending if we were just hiring this, and let's put that money in and take it out as a loan and buy this equipment. At the end of it, we'll own our own system. David will be happy. We'll be independent. And so the name we knew we're getting these Cliptrons, which have this kind of very light, airy feel. It's a very natural sounds, but they're certainly not bass heavy. And I was doing the Arthur book, so I just thought, I quite like the idea of, let's call ourselves Lucky Cloud Sound System, because Arthur had this beautiful song, Lucky Cloud, and I kind of like that kind of floaty thing. And, and Arthur was always at the Loft, of course, because the Loft had the most beautiful and purest sound system in New York City. So Arthur was taking his music so that he could hear it, what it would sound like at the Loft. So there was always this connection between Arthur and David, and they were, really obviously respected each other hugely. So and I like the contrast personally of like Lucky Cloud sounds like all floaty, and then the sound system, it sounds kind of a bit meaner and a bit heavier really. But the two together, I thought somehow work quite well. But the sound system also, because we were kind of, going to be a collective. It increasingly became clear that we were not just, we needed a whole team of volunteers to make this kind of thing work. We never took a penny. We never have taken a penny out of the party. We all have separate incomes, and so we all do it through love of it. And So the sound system was really also about kind of recognising our collectivity. So even though three of us had put our kind of heads on the guillotine, or whatever you would say, about taking out this loan and being responsible for it, it was clear that the party was always about kind of 30, 40, 50 of us who set up, just like David in New York. Except with us, it was really a shared ownership. With David, it is his party. Up until now, I believe it's his party. He owns the equipment and he has the financial responsibility. With us, it was always a shared thing. So that was, the sound system kind of captured that. So that's what we became. And the party's been going since 2003. There was one really great moment, I thought. We were struggling for numbers at one point. We thought, okay, we need to go to do... And we had this idea of going from 4 parties a year to 3 parties a year, so that on the 4th party, we could just have someone within the team, within the sound system, to do music. We'd save on David's air travel, his fee, his modest fee, but still a fee. And that would enable us to keep up with our loan payments, because it was, the numbers weren't quite working, partly because David didn't want us to advertise anywhere, and we respected that. But and David said, and I thought at the time I found this quite shocking, and I was even a bit upset, but I came to understand, it was a part of the learning process. He said, no. He said, I don't want to do that, because it will become internally competitive. People will be comparing me with the other people, and I don't feel comfortable with this. And he said, look, the bottom line is that I'm coming to you, and when I come to you, I don't go around playing with other promoters. I'm committed to you, and I would like the same thing that you commit to me. And through this committed relationship, this is how the party will grow. And it was at that point, actually, that these 2 guys, Simon and Guillaume, who are right from day party one, were in front of the booth, just totally into the music and the culture, and obsessed with it, and really lovely, very, very modest, I should add, people. When we thought, let's go see if we can get them involved a little bit, and they did the most. They just kind of came in to give the most gentle little bit of kind of publicity, a bit of fly postering, I think, just to kind of give it a little. And they've since become absolutely, although their names were ever never on this loan that actually is now repaid, it became 5 of us who were running the parties, really, in between the parties, because there's quite a lot goes on in between along with it. So and they now all share there was also this feeling when David stopped coming over to London that it was a traumatic moment, but also the ultimate test, and it happened already, actually, a few times. David had come over to London puking up in his hotel room because he had caught some bug or something. And it's like, oh my God, what do we do? We got like 300 people or whatever coming to this party, and David's not well enough to play. Colleen was the obvious person to, she'd done it in New York, had the records. A few other people, I would say, had the records, but she was kind of the obvious person to step. And she was great, those early parties, she just came in, and we're like, wow, we can do this. And we offered people who came along a full refund or else to join the party. There was no reduction in price. But then when David stopped coming over, there was quite a lot of discussions, as you can imagine. But the resolution was also that Simon and Guillaume would also kind of share the turntables as well during the year. Partly because we were a group, and there was not, and just to keep things open. And it's really worked out really well. I think we're very happy party. So the parties are still going. 4 times a year. We changed venues, but we're now when we through this whole real estate insanity that's going on in London, in particular, probably even worse than in New York. The venue, the converted power station where we were hosting parties, is going to be knocked down and turned into a massive tower block development by some famous architect. So we had to move. And we actually then found in Hackney, which is a bit more of a kind of community area, it's very mixed race and quite mixed class, although it is also gentrifying, but it's still kind of a lot of original residents are living there. We just stumbled into this community centre, and both Colleen and I and Jeremy went to see it, and I remember Colleen and myself especially walked through the doors, and it just reminded us of 2nd Avenue, actually. Yes. The Ukrainian Centre. It was just like instantaneous. We because we'd looked at about 15 venues, and it was just like we immediately thought, oh yes, this is our home.
So for Love Saves the Day, you started with David, or rather it started out with David. Do you want to tell us a bit about more how Life and Death started, and who did it start with? Sure,
yeah. That was one of the great struggles. I mean, the book was rewritten 3 times, and it was all pretty agonising. But I hope it got there in the end. And the hardest thing was starting the book, finding where to start, because the culture really is about everything at once, and there is, whereas somehow or other, with the 70s, one way or the other, everything seemed to kind of lead back to David, and therefore there was this kind of clear narrative arc. The point about, and the designer tries to capture this on the cover of Life and Death, is like, it's about everything at once. It's this kind of chaotic moment. But the energy of this chaos, of this openness, is what also is the non-defining feature of the scene. Sorry, the defining, non-defining feature of that. It probably doesn't make sense, but maybe you know what I'm trying to say. So how do you begin a book that's about everything at once? So initially, the instinct anyway was to begin with the Paradise Garage and the Loft, because there was a kind of I was kind of half imagining what the readers were going to expect, and I still kind of wonder about that. Like when they open this book and they've read Love Saves the Day, and maybe not the Arthur Russell, though a lot of people have, but some haven't. Are they expecting that story to continue? And it isn't quite that straightforward. Although there's a lot of Loft and an awful lot of Paradise Garage in the new book. But anyway, I tried that, and something wasn't working about that. I mean, I think the first chapter about the Loft and the Paradise Garage is an interesting chapter, but it doesn't quite. It's more about, in particular, David continuing to be what David always was, and he says a few things about disco, but it's not that dramatic, because David kind of keeps on going primarily in the early 1980s. And he does have a little less influence, I would say, in the early 1980s than he did in the 70s, partly because the garage just explodes as this phenomenon, and a lot of it, and a lot of the magnetism and goes around the garage is kind of bigger than the Loft. Larry Levan is more of an extrovert than David. He makes music and remixes that David never did. And all of this stuff. So the garage but the garage in 1980, although it's an interesting story, it's partly about this internal argument that gets resolved between Michael Brodie, wandering partly in association with Mel Sherran, trying to work out how can we get Saturday nights to be successful, because at that time, running up to the end of 1979, it was Friday nights were really kicking off and were great, really kind of fully fledged parties. People were, loving it, but Saturdays were very quiet. And so Michael Brodie had this thing of like, oh, well, prompted by Mel Sherran, maybe I'll try and get the white gay crowd to come along. And they turned Saturdays into a white gay night. And that is they are both white gay men. And that's the scene that they kind of think of as theirs, in inverted commas. They would go to places like Flamingo and what have you. So, that gets resolved. Larry Levan is removed as DJ on Saturday nights. It's quite controversial. There's protests from within the black queer, Latin queer contingent in the garage that, we helped build this venue. How come we can't go? I mean, most people, I talk about this a bit in Love Saves the Day, but it's not part of the general mythology of the garage. But it's something that was kind of interesting that they went through to get to the resolution of what it became. And And then it doesn't really work actually too well. Fridays don't, because the white gay crowd is very happy going primarily to Flamingo, but also to 12 West, and they just don't want to go to the Paradise Garage, which is just a bit too grimy for what they're into. Too grimy an environment, and it doesn't take off. And then it's kind of around this point that Larry Levan is going away for a weekend, and Michael Brodie, or Larry rather, I think, gets T. Scott of Better Days, to one of Larry's mentor figures, and one of the great DJs of the city, who plays at this Better Days, is a largely black gay venue, to stand in for him. And somehow or other, this creates a bit of interest. People go, oh wow, T. Scott's playing at the Garage. This is, it's a bit gossipy, and people want to see how how he does there. So there's a big crowd shows up, and I think he played twice that weekend, and then Larry is back the next weekend, and and he's given both nights, and then the crowd really wants to see how Larry pulls it off on the Saturday night compared to T. And so I just think this kind of little dynamic kind of emerges that helps the Garage take off in 1980. 2 nights a week. Michael Brodie adjusts the kind of membership organisation. And so things fall into place. This is all quite interesting, I think, especially to people who are obsessed with the Garage and maybe the Loft as well, but particularly the Garage. But somehow or other, although the Garage goes on to be very emblematic of the period, it was hard for me to say that in 1980 something happens at that venue that makes it click in terms of the wider narrative of the book. So I tried that, and it wasn't working. Then I tried to do something on the backlash against disco and the withdrawal of the major record companies from disco, and my editor looked at that and he said, look, the problem with this is that the fact, backlash against disco was kind of interesting in Chicago, but no one in New York really noticed. The parties just kept on going. It had become a way of life. People were going out. This is something that happened in suburbs and outside of New York. It's again, it wasn't really capturing the majors withdrawing and therefore leaving the market open. I mean, it's not that interesting. It's an important aspect of what happened, but it's not a really great, compelling way to begin the book. So I tried that. It didn't work. Then I thought, okay, open with New York City. The pitch, the canvas on which this whole extraordinary, to continue the cliche, painting kind of, emerges. And the trouble with that is it's the city is remarkable, but it's not about the culture itself, and the personalities are not particularly in that story about the city. And I wrote it and I tried it, but it felt actually like an intro. It didn't feel like a first chapter where the story really begins. And at that point, I'd been doing lots of research into what I call the art punk scene that was happening around the Mud Club, Club 57, Danceteria, but that's slightly later. And I'd written a lot about this, and interestingly, and the first peer reviewer who read the first draft of the manuscript when this was chapter 4, I think, said that they got this feeling that I wasn't really interested in the art punk stuff, and that I was much more favourable in the way I was writing about the Garage and the Loft. And I thought that was really kind of interesting and almost slightly weird, because I had felt really compelled by the stuff I was beginning to learn about the art punk scene. I'd interviewed Anita Sarko, one of the DJs at the Mud Club, who I would say became a friend and was also just a remarkable person at that period, and we just really clicked over a whole number of things. So I felt really interested in this culture, and that I was writing about it, I thought, in a way that I hope makes it compelling, but clearly there was an outside reader who wasn't agreeing, so that means there's something wrong with the writing. And around this whole period, as this was coming back and I was looking for that opening chapter, I was introduced to Steve Mass, the owner of the Mud Club, who I think had done a very brief interview a few years ago with Simon Reynolds, but again had been someone who otherwise, a bit like David, hadn't been interviewed since, I think it was again like David, weird coincidence, 1983, when he'd done an interview with quite a big interview with East Village Eye. And I thought I initially didn't want to interview Steve Mass because, he has a mixed reputation. He's thought of to be fairly extreme and a difficult person who could sometimes, Anita Sarko maintains that he bullied her, etc. So I thought, let's not meet this guy. It might get a bit awkward. I've got loads of information about the Mud Club. Let's not speak to him. But Jeffrey Deitch, had met, who had already got in touch with me, having read Love Saves the Day and Arthur Russell and wanting to do stuff with me. Then went and met Steve Mass at an art fair in Dubai, of all places, and said, you must speak to him. And I was like, okay, well, this guy had been living in, but I tried to track him down, actually, and he was a recluse. He's not on Facebook and the rest of it. And so we did this, and I thought, okay, we'll just interview him because you've got to. And it became a bit of a David-like thing, basically. It was like we embarked on this 25-hour interview process. I think we spent about 5 hours discussing the terms of the interview. It was very intense indeed. And he's a brilliant guy. He's quite contentious in some ways. Some of his recollections and memories didn't tally with others. Some of his arguments about what the Mud Club was, in his opinion, didn't always tally with others. But he was a remarkable person. He did have a remarkable vision. He is extraordinarily bright. And he did, although it wasn't quite like the Loft, he did go on to inspire 100 copycat parties, or parties that, this Mud Club did become this place where just all this extraordinary profusion of culture really did take root. Of all the art punk places, it was there that it really kind of first exploded, this bringing together all these different elements. And so I interviewed him intensely, and that brought it all together. And all of a sudden, that was kind of my chapter one. And there was just this great little moment, which I was probably already had, but it made me understand how this could work. There was this great little point in the Mud Club that was at the beginning of 1980, very late 79, maybe very early 80, I can't quite remember. Johnny Dynell, he wasn't a DJ, he was an artist in a no-wave band, like so many people, and he wanted to earn some money. He was living above the Mud Club in a painter's studio, Ross Bleckner, who owned the building at that time. Then he sold it to Steve Mass, but at the time it was Ross Bleckner's building, and Johnny Dynell was living in one of Ross's studios, and he wanted to earn a bit of money. So he approached Steve Mass, can I have a job? And Steve Mass said, what do you want to do? Do you want to be a bartender? And because that was kind of what people did. The DJing was kind of below bartender almost in terms of status at that point. And Johnny was like, I'd like to DJ. And his idea was, although he was kind of, his idea was the ultimate punk gesture in a punk club would be to dress up as if you're John Travolta and do the draw daché jeans kind of thing that was the big style at Studio 54, quiff up your hair like John Travolta, and play disco music, because that would be the thing that the punks least like to listen to, and therefore the punk gesture is to do exactly that. And there was, Johnny recounted in interviews, there was certainly some hostility to this gesture. Some people say, why don't you fuck off back to Studio 54, or why don't you stop playing this nigger shit and that kind of stuff. But what the main response was people danced. So rather than the punks kind of really hating this moment, which was only done as performance art, basically, they danced to this quite commercial disco. And it was just this great moment. And it was like, there's the book's kind of story in a nutshell. It was like these two cultures that had been at war with each other, supposedly during the 70s, punk versus disco, disco versus punk, and yet both are exhausted by the late 1970s. Something new needs to happen, and here we have, in the place where there's, they're all supposed to hate disco, a punk DJ kind of comes along to play disco as a punk gesture, and people dance. So that just seemed to kind of capture the way that, everything then unfolded about this kind of hybrid mutant mashup culture that came to define the period.
Sure. One of Jeffrey, we attended your panel at NYU the other day, and Jeffrey leaned heavily on the idea of convergence, and that's
Absolutely.
A big theme in the book.
Oh, massive, yeah.
Can you just talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, well, it was really about the... there's so many different angles to convergence. It's another big... You're asking these questions that, at least to me, seem to be quite big, so I'll try to... I'm just worried I know these answers.
It's by design, honestly.
But convergence is a big theme of the book, and it's really about all these different discrete, or what we could say are discrete, previously. Excuse me. Convergence is what we could say are these previously discrete elements coming together in combination, and through that coming together they become, the sum is more than the individual parts, that kind of idea. And so convergence, there's all these different articulations. One of the things I'll throw in quickly, which I said at that panel, and I'd kind of worked out who was going to appear on it, so I was always conscious of the blind spot of that panel, And I was hoping they would address it, and when they didn't quite, I thought I'd throw it in. It's there wasn't only convergence in the art punk scene; it was happening all over New York, and at somewhere like the Loft or the Garage, it was the convergence was partly the crowd, the plurality of the crowds coming together from different parts of the city. But it was also about musical convergence. You could hear in a sense, all the music in the world would become part of these sonic tapestries that would unfold for 12 or 14 or even 18-hour parties that Loft was lasting for at some point. So I thought this idea of all these, and that being, this was always DJ culture. I always thought was about convergence. Is you have these individual records are great, but what would you rather do? Would you like to? I mean, I love live music. You can have a fantastic time listening to live music, but there is something about the notion of this democratic conversation that happens between the DJ and the crowd when it reaches its potential, and the DJ has at her or his hands or disposal all of this musical possibilities, and you can create a new musical kind of improvised democratic kind of selection in dialogue with the crowd. This to me is like music doesn't get higher than this. I don't think in some ways, in terms of its complexity, its potential, and it's bringing together all these discrete elements to create something even greater. So that's going on at the Loft and the Garage, obviously. But then there's also this idea of convergence of all these different artists who have been working discreetly, suddenly finding that they can collaborate to do all sorts of, cross arts, multimedia possibilities, which flourish in this period. Collaboration goes through the roof. Brian Eno comes over from London to New York in the spring, I believe it is, of 1979 to produce a Talking Heads album. He's planning on staying for 3 weeks. He stays for 3 years, and he does an interview in 1980 in NME in which he says, look, there was just a greater sense of potential and possibility in New York than London. When I was in New York, I felt I could do things that I never felt I could do in London because of this convergence, because of this collaboration that was going on between all these artists willing to collaborate beyond their realm of speciality and willing to kind of enter into this kind of music, this sort of culture rather, that brought all these different elements and art forms together. And then you have this thing where, one example that's kind of big in the book and was referenced obviously at the seminar was you have these artists start to go into bands. Jean-Michel Basquiat forming Grey is one really, really interesting example of this, but it was going on all over the place. People who didn't know how to play a musical instrument basically deciding to form a band because that was a means of expression. Then you had art, then you had musicians creating art. So one of the most interesting, there was an explosion of art shows in this period, and one of the most interesting is curated by a guy called Diego Cortez, who was a kind of key figure in the founding of the Mud Club. And he curated this exhibition at PS1 called New York New Wave, which was primarily, there was a lot of graffiti there, but it was primarily new wave musicians deciding to do various forms of painting, of art. So this was another, and this was just going on in all the time in this period. Keith Haring would get up and do kind of rap poetry or what have you. It was just, there are thousands of examples in the book, and clearly the book is just a little snapshot of what was going on. So there were hundreds of thousands, million, of this kind of people just like deciding to try something that they hadn't tried before. Because in an Arthur Russell-esque kind of way, people were insisting on their freedom. That was the most important thing to do, to follow what they wanted to do. So, the idea, the basic idea is that it is this convergence that comes to define the era. It makes it almost indescribable, beyond summary, beyond synopsis. But it's this very means that the Renaissance is so powerful. If everything had been segregated out and separated out, I wouldn't have written the book. It wouldn't have been that interesting. The culture wouldn't have been that interesting. And there's all these bands that start to converge. All this music starts to converge. Arthur Russell's Go Bang, which he plays, an interesting one. It's got new wave guitarists on it. It's got composers from the kitchen scene that Arthur came from originally when he moved to New York. Well, actually started up at the museum, the Manhattan School of Music, and then went down to the kitchen. It's got Julius Eastman, a kind of opera singer who does this kind of extraordinary orgasmic kind of solo, and he's also playing keyboards. It's got the Ingram brothers, I believe, are part of making up the rhythm section, which is this kind of funk, soul, R&B group from Philadelphia. All these different elements are coming onto that record. But this was just typical of the time. I mean, it was a particularly amazing example of this, but it was just going on, all this kind of liquid, as we also heard at the NYU Symposium. They were a punk band, basically, but then they start bringing in funk elements and Latin elements and even disco-y kind of elements, and it just, the music goes off in a different direction. ESG is, just kind of there bringing together kind of funk and sort of discrete Latin elements and obviously kind of a more punky kind of style. So, and this is just, you go Peach Boys have got... It starts out as a standard rock band, and then they bring in Michael De Benedictus, brings in Larry Levan, and all of a sudden on "Don't Make Me Wait," there's kind of there's this kind of, you suddenly have elements of, there's rock, but then there's also soul, and there's elements of disco, and there's dub spatialization. And Francois Kevorkian is making music with kind of disco groups, but suddenly there's elements of kind of, dub is sweeping in onto this, and elements of kind of edge that hadn't been there before. So the music of the music converges as well, and it's about these three scenes coming. I mean, Planet Rock is another example where people sort of now think it's kind of, the beginning of electro, but no one was calling it that at the time, or it's some kind of rap, but it was all, as Arthur Baker was a disco producer. And as I say in the book, and I haven't really read elsewhere, one of the things he really wanted to do on this record was bring in drama, dance floor drama, and the idea of, of journeys and of crescendos. And he had been listening, as had the city, like crazy to the Peach Boys, Don't Make Me Wait, this huge record from the era. And that inspired him to do a lot of what he did in Planet Rock. And you can hear it. And this was a rock group, and they come out with, because of this convergence, come out with a record like with Larry Levan's input, like Don't Make Me Wait. So that's what it's all about, really.
I want to keep chatting 20 more hours about this. I think we really want to hear and go out with Peach Boys.
Great. Great. Good choice.
With that being said, we really want to thank you for taking your time to talk to us. I know you have a super packed schedule with, book tour activities and symposium and, doing Rough Trade, did NYU and so on. So thanks again. This, for those who haven't had a chance to get the book yet, it's out on Duke University Press.
Yep.
A huge honor.
Oh, well, the honor is all mine. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to meet you guys. I know you're really invested in the culture and the Loft and the better days and the this and the that. So it's, it's great. So it really has been a lot of fun. And I just sorry my answers have been a bit long.
No, it's nice to meet someone as obsessed with dance music as we are.
All right, great. So we've had a good time. We can agree.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. No, thank you. It's been great.
In Conversation was produced by Dublab, a nonprofit radio station broadcasting live from Los Angeles since 1999. Sound editing and theme song by Matea Baim. For more programming, visit dublab.com. And thank you for listening.